voters of Lincoln-Lancaster County. We are so excited that Rachel Gibson is here to speak with us today about representation. Rachel Gibson is the Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. You may also be familiar with her from the action alerts she sends out, and also from last year's really wonderful Sunday session on session, where she shared with us updates about what was going on in the legislature every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. Before becoming a vice president of action at League of Women Voters of Nebraska, Rachel was the director of education policy. She was a member of the Fair Maps Redistricting Committee and a member of the Social Policy Action Team. And on top of all of that, she spent a decade in higher education as an advisor, an educator, and program coordinator in Kansas and Nebraska. Today, she'll be talking with us about representation. The title of her talk is Representation Under Threat: Keeping Nebraskans at the Center of Redistricting, Ballot Initiatives, and Voter Access Legislation, which, if you've been following any of the news that has been happening in 2025, is a big set of issues, especially for Nebraskans, and we're fortunate to have her here. So she will speak about what representation is, how it is done, why it matters, and what it means to and for Nebraskans. Finally, we would love to have your questions, and Rachel would love to answer them. So there are two ways you can do that. Either first, you can put your questions in the chat as you have them. I will be monitoring the questions, and so you can be sure that if you ask a question there, we will get it and we will get it to Rachel. Or you can hold your question until the end if you'd like to ask Rachel directly during the question and answer period at the end of Rachel's talk. So, as Paula asked, please make sure you are muted, and we'll go ahead and get started with Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the welcome. This is one of my favorite groups to talk to. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We'll see if this works for everyone. Can folks see my screen okay? I don't
Yep,
hear any.
it's great.
Perfect. All right, great. Well, as mentioned, my name is Rachel Gibson. I am the Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. I know many of you, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about representation and what that means and some of the concerning things we're seeing. So as mentioned, this could be a huge topic, so I'm really going to hone in on redistricting and ballot initiatives in Nebraska. So before we get started, you all are very familiar with the League of Women Voters. So of course, a nonpartisan nonprofit grassroots organization. Our goal is advocating for democracy, especially as things become hyper partisan. I just always draw us back to that's our goal is to promote democracy. We work in two areas: voter services, so registering voters. Many of the people on the call do this, and then legislative advocacy, which is more the area that I work in. And we have our 6 action teams that focus in these different areas. So today, what I want to talk about, though, is a little bit about representation broadly. What is it? It's something that I feel like we all kind of gut reaction. We're like, oh yeah, that's representative or not. But let's actually talk about that, because we're in a time where people are framing things how they would like to frame them. So we're going to get down to the basics as a starting point. Then we're going to talk about 2 specific ways that redistricting right now in particular are under threat, and that's through redistricting, what it is, why it matters, kind of where we're at in Nebraska, the national context, which is changing rapidly. And then we'll talk a little bit about the ballot initiative and referendum process, quick overview of that, and then some of the recent things we've seen kind of tinkered with in here in Nebraska, and what we can expect and what we're concerned about going forward. So and then we'll talk about what you can do, because I'm going to be real, by the time we get to the end, it's a little stressful, but there are things we can do. So we'll definitely take some time to talk about that. And then of course, questions. Before I hop in, I do want to just touch base about the word nonpartisan. This is becoming used in a way that I don't think is accurate necessarily. So I just want to be really clear. When I say nonpartisan, I mean that we do not endorse a politician, a political party, a person, but we do talk about policy. And so I'm going to speak very frankly about policy. I've cited my sources. We aren't endorsing anything, but there is absolutely no way to talk about our representation right now without talking about parties. So just want to clarify, I'm going to talk about parties. I'm going to be factual, but we are nonpartisan in the fact that we're not endorsing one or the other. So just wanted that disclaimer there. So let's talk about representation. Again, in our gut, it's kind of like, of course, we know what representation is, but like, let's go down to the basics because that is really being challenged right now. So you can see when you talk about the word represent, dictionary definition, we talk about serving as a delegate or an agent or a spokesperson, right? So then we talk about representative. You'll see that right there, it says member of a governmental body, usually legislative, chosen by popular vote. So like, that's the foundation of what we're talking about here. So what does political representation mean practically? Because again, great, we got that idea, but what does that really mean? And I think this is a great definition. The activity of making citizens' voices, opinions, and perspective present in public policy making process. So that could be speaking, advocate, symbolize, or an act on behalf of others in the political arena. Now, when you read that, that doesn't just mean elected officials, right? So there's all kinds of representation. That could be an advocate. That could be a lobbyist. That could be a group who speaks on someone's behalf. But what we're talking about is the elected officials. And what's unique about them is that in theory, their only responsibility is to represent their constituents. So unlike a lobbyist who's working for a specific organization, or there might be some political or monetary benefit, in theory, our representatives are just supposed to be representing us. So that raises a really interesting question, and one that we've heard some of our state senators really digging into about, well, what does that actually mean? What's my role as a representative? And there's kind of two ways to think about it. On one end, we have this idea of a delegate. So this is simply someone who's following the expressed preferences of their constituents. Makes sense, right? You think about our presidential delegates. They're just formally going to say, this is who my voting district voted for. Now, as we've seen in the past few years, that's gotten a little spicy. So even that is a little, there's some leeway with it, which is even more important why we're talking about it. So delegate just doing exactly what? Now, on the other side of the spectrum is the idea of a trustee. So this approach is that our elected officials are following their own understanding of what the best action to pursue is. There are good and bad things about both of these, because delegate, if you, as an elected representative, you have access to potentially more information, more people, more perspective, you have more time, potentially more knowledge to dig into issues. That's why we have representatives, right? But at the same time, the goal is to represent your people, not necessarily special interests or something that would benefit you personally. So in my mind, it's a combination of both of these, right? We want people to use the information they have, especially when we look at our like Nebraska legislature. We want people to say, how is that going to affect people in a different community from me? You know, where's the happy median that's going to help everybody? At the same time, if your entire community is saying, don't do this, you should probably listen to them. So it is this continuum. So because this is kind of hairy, let's see what does our Constitution say? You know, let's go back to the source document. They don't really say anything. So there's nothing explicitly about representation in our document. We talk around it. We have some policies and things written that kind of allude to it, but there's nothing specific about representation. There is some guidance about voting, but again, that's not even super, super clear in some cases. And this is a good point to clarify that voting is a tool to reach representation. Representation is what we're trying to get to, someone fairly presenting our needs and concerns. Voting is how we get there. Both of them are important, and we'll talk about how we leverage both of them, but that's an important distinction. So back to what the Constitution says, neither the US or Nebraska Constitution says a lot about representation, and actually they don't even specifically talk about a right to vote. So we do have amendments and things that say you can't restrict access to vote to people like women or formerly enslaved individuals, things like that. 10 years ago, I might look at that and be like, so we're essentially saying we have the right to vote, right? But in the climate we're in now, there's the potential for someone to come and say, well, we don't explicitly say you have it, so it doesn't really mean just because we say you can't means that you automatically have that right to vote. So that's a really important clarification. And one I think we should fight against, because again, a lot of this, I'm going to go through the factual pieces, but we're in an environment where um, people say things enough times, or they say it with enough gusto, or they reference something, it feels like that's the truth. I think that this is a really good time for us to gut check. There's a lot of stuff we're talking about today that people just innately go, that doesn't seem right. And we need to acknowledge that and challenge those times when we hear that from other people. So how do we decide what we're going to do with representation here if we're not finding it out from the Constitution? We have to rely on the guidelines of legislation. Voting Rights Act is a good example, or on judicial decisions as a guide. So if they'd gone to court and said, no, you can't actually do that, that's how we're starting to kind of create our representation. And really the way to protect it the most is through structures and processes, which sounds super boring, but is really, really, really important. And so it's these effective tools of including voting, how we build our system to ensure that we're able to have that representation. So how do we make it fair and real? I've kind of identified generally what it is. What are those processes? Again, I love this quote that really gets to it. It must not only promote the public interest, but also be responsive and responsible to that public, and by its very nature, be under constant construction to become more representative. This is such a good way to think about it because, particularly when we get to redistricting, we have to change things. Our voting districts have to change. Populations move. If we kept our voting districts the same as they were 50 years ago, when the same number of people lived in two districts, now they've all moved, one representative is going to be representing 3 people and the other is going to be representing 3 million. We have to change. And so that's part of the process, is that we're constantly making things representative and responsive. Okay, so nuts and bolts, what does that actually mean? Voting policy. Prioritizing accessibility, security, transparency, removing things like voter suppression tools, and encouraging policies that include everyone and make voting accessible. So things like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, those types of things. So that's one. Voting is a very important way to start protecting representation. The other that's getting a little hairy, and honestly, we haven't really thought too much about until lately. We've been very focused on voting policy, which is fair, but we're in a new environment, so we really need to think about how our institutions are structured and not just rely on norms. So when we think about institutional structure and process, the types of things that are going to ensure that fair representation is access to representatives. Do our representatives have a phone number you can call? Do they host town halls in their communities that they actually can be asked questions? Access to representatives is a huge part. Same thing with transparency and press access. In Nebraska, we are very lucky to have a unicameral that has press built in a way that has more access than a lot of places. But recently, we've seen a lot of attempts to start to exclude the press. And that is a key part of being able to keep things representative, because that's that conduit between the people and the people's house. And then the last two here, I'm just highlighting, there are many others, but the two we're going to talk about today: fair redistricting, and then citizen-led ballot initiatives and referendums. And those play together. They're very related. And then finally, an educated and involved citizenry. That's you lovely people. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you do. We can structurally build this. Maybe that's increasing civic education, but it's also just culturally that we need to, really encourage and foster. So these are the very practical ways we make sure our systems are continuing to be representative. Now, I want to take a quick note and talk about the idea of republic and democracy, because this has come up a few times when I talk on this, and I was caught off guard the first time, because there is a narrative, you may have heard, that we aren't really a democracy, we're a republic. Well, we're both. So actually, more specifically, we're a federal constitutional representative democracy, if we really want to get into what that means. Federal means we share we share power with the states and the country government, national government. Constitutional means that we are bound by the Constitution and laws, not by a religious text, not by one individual, not a set of individuals, but that's what bases our authority and our power. And this is the key I want to focus on. Representative, so republic, means that we elect a group of people to make decisions. The opposite of that is if every single one of us voted on every single thing. That's a direct democracy. So we are a representative democracy. However, we are democracy because that means that the decisions are ultimately made of and by the people. The opposite of democracy is not a republic, it is an autocracy or a monarch, somewhere where we're giving the authority of the decision making completely to someone else that we have no recourse. So the reason I bring this up, and I just want to highlight that we use these terms interchangeably. Representative democracy has been used since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Like, this is a term we've used forever. The reason I bring this up is because we're seeing a resurgence of using this argument to diminish the public's voice. So instead of saying, well, you don't really get a vote because we're not a democracy, we're a republic. So it's really the people who are elected that should be making all the decisions because we're a republic. That aligns in my mind very much to the conversation about the Civil War being fought solely for states' rights, because there's like a little piece in there that's kind of true. States' rights were a part of that, but that's also completely missing the point that it was predominantly about slavery. Same kind of idea. And when you look at the history of the republic versus the democracy debate, started in 1930s isolationism, and then it really came back during the 1960s against the 1960s civil rights movement. So I want to throw that out there because I'm hearing more talk about that and it makes me a little nervous. Okay, soapbox done, at least on that one. So let's shift gears and talk about two specific ways with this representation piece that I really think we need to be looking at right now. The first is redistricting. Redistricting is, like I alluded to earlier, redrawing our districts so our populations are the same for each voting district. Begs the question, what is a voting district? Broadly, conceptually, it's the community we live, work, play, learn in, right? Again, this is another area where it's like you know what your community is. Like when I think about, oh, I live in the Rockbrook area, in my mind, I know what that is. But then you have to put some hard lines around that when it comes to voting districts, because the purpose of those districts is to have a geographic area with people who represent you at multiple levels. And that's another thing to think of is you've got your city councilor, but you also have your state representative. You also have your House of Representatives member nationally. No, there are lots of people who, like, your next door neighbor could be in the same legislative district, but a different congressional district. So everybody has all these different pieces working for them. But ultimately, it's that voting district. We're trying to put lines around something to allow people to speak with one voice. So why is this important? Why are we even talking about this? Number one, communities vary, therefore their needs vary. And I'm not going to get too in depth here, but I just want to highlight these. The first you'll see there, that map, is population who are civilian veterans. The middle one is for-profit and nonprofit firms. And the third one is rental units. And the darker is the higher percent. The reason I like to highlight this is I can go back to last session and point to bills that affect each one of these, that have an impact on this policy. But what I really highlight with this is look at those maps. They don't match. We have been put into this idea of, harsh partisanship of it's red or blue, or even geographic partisanship in a way. It's rural or urban. It's not. Our districts are very complex. And so I want to highlight that, like, the ultimate goal is someone who is representing all that diversity and all that difference in a given district. So that's the first part. Reason number two, we got high stakes, friends. So nationally, when we think about this, for a majority in the House of Representatives, you need 218 representatives. Currently, we have 219 in the majority. One vote, one person. And particularly on the national level, this is important because the majority controls what bills get heard, the leadership of committees, what gets scheduled. It is that one person, that one vote swings not only policy, but what we even talk about. And it has real implications. This isn't theoretical. These are some real impacts of the big, beautiful bill. Whether you love it or you hate it, the acknowledgement is these are big things, right? So these are big policies that we're talking about that ultimately rest on essentially one vote, one district. Same thing at the state level. We have our unicameral 49 senators. You do 33 to overcome a filibuster. We've got 16 in the minority, so it is real close. Now, I will say our unicameral and nonpartisan structure is a huge safety net for us. Unlike nationally, the majority does not get to control what bills get heard or leadership. They are not structurally built in that way. But again, still, 1 or 2 votes is really close. And again, the impacts, whether you like them or you don't, they're huge. They are very big. Which brings me to point 3 to round it home, which is why is this important? Because those minute changes can make a huge difference. So I won't go through all of these. I usually have people guess what the closest one was. But these are in the past 20 years, the closest legislative races. Ken Haar in 2008 won District 21 by 20 votes. That is a block. So when we talk about drawing lines of voting districts, that's literally 1 block over, right? This is why this is so important, how the maps are drawn. I also like to highlight right up there at the top, Deb Fisher, her first election, she won by 128. And she's now one of the biggest decision makers for our state. So the implications are beyond just a session or 2. I also like to highlight the Nebraska second, just because this is one that gets a lot of conversation. And what I want to highlight here again is that in 6 of the 7 most recent elections, it's been less than 6,000 votes that have decided this district. That's an apartment complex, right? So again, when you put it in terms of geography, the maps really, really matter. So how do we get these voting districts? How are they made? They are made through redistricting. Again, the counting of the people and trying to split them equally, but you can split them lots of ways, right? So we're going to talk about this in terms of pizza math. My 8-year-old is very invested in how many pepperonis he gets on pizza. Doesn't care the size of the pizza. He's invested in the number of pepperonis. So in a perfect world, and think of pepperonis as voters here, it's neat, it's tidy. We've got 4 slices that are the same physical size and also have the same numbers of pepperonis. However, much like our population, most pizzas don't look like that. They look more like this. So if I was to cut them to the same physical size and I tried to give Finn the first slice, he would lose his mind because he only has 1 pepperoni and his brother has a million. So this is the idea. To get him the right number of pepperonis, which is the most important part, we have to cut the pizza a little differently to get the equal number. So this is the concept of apportionment, redistricting with pizza math. Now, some people will say like, okay, cool, like just cut the pizza, right? There's a million ways you can cut it. And that's the issue, is that gerrymandering is redistricting gone wrong. That's the term we use when people have manipulated maps for political advantage of a person, a party, a group, but that is redistricting gone wrong. So I do this with students, and oftentimes they're like, but if the numbers are the numbers, like it doesn't matter. However you cut it, the numbers are the numbers. Not so, my friend. So let's take the pizza example again. This time we've got 2 types of meat to represent 2 different political parties. So we've got ham and pepperoni, 10 of each. Same pizza. Each slice, we're going to decide what it is based on the majority meat of the slice, and then the majority of pieces makes the pizza what it is. So let me walk you through. In this case, the way we've cut this, we have 3 slices that have more pepperoni than ham. Therefore, we have 3 slices of pepperoni pizza, and it is a pepperoni pizza because 3 of the 4 slices are pepperoni. Now we can take the exact same pizza, cut it just a little bit differently, and now we have 3 slices that are predominantly ham. And then therefore, it's a ham pizza. And we can cut it yet again, not too much change, and have what's probably the most representative, which is 2 slices have majority ham, 2 slices have majority pepperoni, half and half. This is a half and half pizza, which is the most reflective of the 10 pieces of ham, 10 pieces of pepperoni. This is how people gerrymander. This is how numbers can be manipulated. Thank you for going on that pizza journey with me. Hopefully this kind of makes sense, that it's how we cut, slice and dice things. And why this matters is because manipulating these districts through gerrymanders is a form of voter suppression, because it's making it mathematically difficult or impossible for a certain candidate from a group to win. That's the idea of gerrymandering. So usually redistricting is like low-key. We kind of think about it every 10 years because we usually do it after the census. Why is it in the news right now? The national landscape. So the biggest piece of this is a couple months ago, the Trump administration encouraged Texas to draw new legislative maps before the next election to shift more districts to keep a Republican majority. This is not reading the tea leaves. This is literally what has been said publicly and the purpose. So this was what kicked all of this off. Democratic-led states have countered to say two can play at that game. And because the method of how states redistrict is different by states, we're having some different impacts. So, for example, California was the first state to say, well, we're going to do it too. But in Texas, the legislature redistricts, so the governor can say, we're doing this. In California, several years ago, they moved to an independent commission because they wanted to make it less political. But now that means that the governor can't just say, we're redoing this. Now they find kind of a loophole. They're going to go through and have the people vote to say, can we work on this before the next election? But that is some of the complication of this process. Now, again, gut check. I was talking to a bunch of high schoolers the other day, and they're like, you can't do this. This is cheating, right? And I said, it doesn't feel right, does it? But the rules, as set by the Supreme Court, says that, yes, in fact, you can gerrymander politically. The only way you cannot gerrymander, according to our current law and constitution, is racially. So you can't say, here's one racial group, I want to make sure that they can't, I want to split them in half in two different districts. But you can say, I want to take the Republicans and split them between two districts. Now, the unfortunate part is there is, not in all cases, but in many, there's overlap between those two. So they have the potential to gerrymander racially and then argue that, no, I didn't want to split the Black community. I just wanted to split up, the Democrats or whoever, enter party and group there. So it gets really fuzzy. Now, again, national landscape wise, where we're at right now, Republicans have control of more state governments. And again, because redistricting is done at the state level, Democrats have more to lose in this situation. But really, voters, we are the ones who are losing. It doesn't matter whose party, we are the ones who are losing. Because the goal is to represent our needs, and our needs are not separated into red and blue. So this is where we are right now with redistricting. You'll see that we really did start the dominoes. Texas, and actually Missouri has now passed theirs. So Texas and Missouri, the only two who have actually passed their maps and will be using the new maps in the next election. California is going to be voting on it in November. You'll see the others listed there. Kansas is actually talking a lot about it, which makes me mad because I'm from Kansas. And so these are the states that are looking at it. I want to show some really practical things to because you can conceptualize it, but what does that actually look like? So Texas, first state to do it, that's why I'm including it. The previous maps had 25 districts that had a statistical advantage towards Republicans and 13 for Democrats of their House of Representatives seats. The new maps have 30 districts that are statistically advantageous to Republicans and 8 for Democrats. This map, I think, highlights why this is such an issue. So at the top, you can see those statistics. You can see that there is a significant change in percentages of folks who voted for Trump or Harris. But the more important part to me is when I looked at these maps initially, I was like, that's not the same area of Texas. It is. And to demonstrate, this red box here is going around the lake outside of Austin. This is where that lake is on the second map. So they have totally expanded. The Woodlands, if anybody's familiar, that's right near Houston. So they took a district that was primarily Austin and have now extended part of it all the way to Houston in an effort to adjust who could potentially win that. This highlights the point. How does a representative represent that space? Is that a community? I think Missouri is an even better example of this. And I want to be clear, I am using Texas and Missouri because those are the only two who have actually passed maps. California has not. As soon as they do, I will have it on here. But that's the reason I'm using these two. So you can see here on the left, old districts, on the right, new districts. The numbers aren't as high, but I think this one highlights so much. I used to live in Kansas City on the Kansas side, but I am mad on behalf of the people in Kansas City on the Missouri side because there is now split right down the middle. And even more than that, I'm frustrated for the people who live in the middle of the 5th district. Because imagine if someone is trying to advocate for policy. In the first map, 5 can be like, all Kansas City, all this, this is what we're focusing on, and 5 can do what it needs to do. But in the second map, what happens when a representative is having to weigh something that may benefit the city more than it does a rural community? How are they supposed to represent those people? It flies in the face of the idea of that representative piece. Okay, so again, sorry, soapbox, I care very deeply about this. But the takeaway with redistricting is that voters are not mathematical projects. We are not something you can draw on a map and manipulate. We are ultimately people who are voting for our communities. So if we all actually are educated and go out and vote, the maps don't matter. But that's a heavy lift, right? So that's the takeaway. Don't put me in a box. All right, let's shift gears. And I'm so sorry that I'm going so fast. There's just so much to talk about. Let's shift gears and talk about ballot initiatives and referendums. So I like having this in the juxtaposition of redistricting because redistricting is the way to manipulate who represents us. So another fix is, well, then we'll just do it ourselves, which is what direct democracy is. Direct democracy is where the people vote. We don't vote on someone to vote. We vote on something. In Nebraska, it is listed first in our Constitution ahead of the legislature. That gives me some sense of the people who wrote our Constitution, what they were thinking, right? So the people should be first. In Nebraska, we can add or change laws. That's called an initiative. We can amend the state constitution. That's also an initiative for a constitutional amendment. And we can repeal a law that the legislature has recently passed. That is referred to as a referendum. So they get used interchangeably. They are actually different things. Not every state has this tool. We are one of only 26 states that have some form of direct democracy. And holy mackerel, do we use it. So this is that process of the ballot initiatives and referendum. I'm not going to go in too depth, but just because I know that there's a lot of folks on this call who are intimately familiar with how the referendum and initiative process works. But essentially, someone who has an interest in doing something takes that to the Secretary of State. They make sure the language is okay. They give it the approval. The group has to collect a certain number of signature. That then goes back to the Secretary of State who says, yes, you have this many number. And then they send those out to all the counties to make sure all of those signatures are valid. And if they are, then it gets placed on the ballot. So that's generally the big picture process. Now, to actually get on the ballot, there's a certain threshold of signatures needed. And, there are it's 4 different things, but the range is between 5 and 10% of registered voters. So you can see the different numbers needed there, depending on if it's constitutional or a law, that type of thing. Additionally, 5% of those signatures have to come from voters in 38 of the 93 counties. And that is to ensure that we're actually getting a statewide issue voted on at the statewide level. So that's a piece. There's some good pieces to that. There's some bad pieces to that, but that is where we're at right now. So once it's on the ballot, everyone votes on it, and it passes if it's 50% plus one person. The only kind of asterisk to that is at least 35% of voters who cast ballots have to vote for the measure. So you can't have like no one voted on it except for 4 people, but 3 of the 4 voted on it, so now it's law. You have to have a certain number of voters to vote on it. And like I said, Nebraskans, boy, howdy, do we use this. These are the 6 initiatives, and I know some folks on this call worked on these. The 6 initiatives from last election. We had 3 the election before that. We had 6 the election before that. We are using it more. So previously, there were fewer, usually just 1 or 2. But this is a tool that we use, and it has really big impacts. So we have this really wonderful ballot initiative process that we've been using more because our representative part of the democracy, we don't necessarily feel like is representing us as Nebraskans. So we're doing it ourselves through direct democracy. And now that is coming under threat in a new way. So I have a couple examples from last session. As you saw, we passed a lot of different ones. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but 4 I want to highlight. So paid sick leave this spring, the voters passed overwhelmingly. The legislature took actions to basically like roll that back and adjust who that had to apply to. So it exempts agricultural workers, workers under 16. It lowers the small business side to 10. The one that gets me the most is that it also took out the piece that said that workers are allowed to take action against an employer if they violate that policy. Some of our legislators are arguing, well, we have to make things workable, and we're the ones who have all the knowledge about how to make things workable, and we're the ones who are hearing from people, which is a fair argument. But when you literally strike the exact language that was in the ballot initiative, that's not making it workable. That is undermining the people's vote. Minimum wage is the least one that's been tinkered with, and this one very much that's many senators I've talked to talk about how they're working to make this workable, and I can see the perspective they're coming from. At the same time, if your constituents are still telling you not to do it, you need to work with that. So minimum wage, it did not pass. The adjustments to it did not pass last session. The latest version would exempt employers from having to pay minimum wage to certain age groups. And then it also changes the tool that's kind of the fixed growth rate in the future. So we don't have to keep passing minimum wage bills. Again, that didn't pass, but it will be back this spring. Medical cannabis is one where we were asking them to please do something and they didn't do something. So I think this one really highlights the fact that it's not just that the legislature is wanting to make everything that we pass workable, because they specifically did not pass the thing we do need guidance on to make workable. So we passed medical cannabis. They tried to put some guardrails around that. You know, do you need certain conditions for that? Do you have a card? Is there a database? Things like that. Couldn't get that through. Instead, the executive branch that very much does not support medical marijuana appointed 2 critical of medical marijuana folks to the Medical Cannabis Commission to set those guidelines. They have not set them. They have missed several deadlines now. So it is hard to not read this as any other thing than trying to slow down that process. And then finally, again, I know a lot in this group are probably familiar with this, the concept of public dollars for private schools. This is another one where it is no legislation was passed in direct conflict. However, the referendum that went through 2 runs of getting signatures, 1 vote that Nebraskans overwhelmingly said no, please. The bill that was the foundation for that got introduced again as the exact same bill this session. So the argument of yeah, we're totally listening to the people. It just rings a little hollow for some of our senators. And meanwhile, we also have things like the Nest 529 use of kind of a workaround to get public benefits somehow to private schools, K through 12 schools. That did get passed. And that, if you look at the history of school privatization movements, that's usually a first step. So again, even when they're not directly rolling back, the kind of approach is we don't really care what you told us about how you feel about this issue. So these are why we're concerned, is because we're seeing this coming back. And it's very tricky because, again, there is some responsibility to make things workable, but when the pattern is to undercut, it is hard to appreciate any of that adjustment that needs to be made. Additionally, it's really hard to believe when this is a national trend. So this is things that are happening in other states, and now we're really looking at our own and saying, uh-oh, is this coming to us? Other states recently have had legislation that is increasing the percentage needed to pass something by ballot initiative. So moving it from 50% to 60%. There's also a lot of policy about over-regulating the signature collection process. The one that's totally just blows my mind is that people can only collect signatures from the people they live in the same county as. So then when I think about that practically, you go to the Omaha farmers market, you are going to have someone from Douglas, Sarpy, Cass, you know, all the different counties, Saunders, somebody who came from Scotts Bluff that day. So it's things like that where it's a structured effort to make that more difficult. There's also been a lot of increased legal involvement and scrutiny. We have definitely seen that already here in Nebraska with the medical marijuana in particular. And then the piece we've seen the most here in Nebraska is that state legislators slow walking or tweaking or changing, blocking implementation. The newest pattern we're seeing, and this is what I am probably the most concerned about right now, is the restriction on funders or participants. So what organizations can be part of an initiative. For those who have worked before, these coalitions are big and varied, and it's so important to have that. As the league, when we do our advocacy side, we work on that stuff. But also who funds these. So is it an organization? Is it an individual? If you don't let any organizations, but only individuals, a handful of really wealthy people can be the only ones running ballot initiatives. So with that, what are we looking at? What are we worried about here in Nebraska? The first thing, and it's coming up soon, is the interim study hearing about the ballot initiative process. This is LR 206 from Senator Stroman. It's scheduled for Friday, October 24th at 9:30 a.m. Senator Stroman was one of the most vocal about not trusting the ballot initiative process. And a lot of his critiques and concerns centered around out-of-state funding and paid circulators. Even in cases where it's like we have factual information to say, I did that circulation and I didn't get paid. You know what I mean? So we had that from him, that he's very critical of that these aren't Nebraskans who want this or funding this or doing the work for it, which just is not true. It's complicated, kind of like the Republic versus democracy thing, because there is funding from out of state for ballot initiatives, because a ballot initiative baseline costs $5 million. Because think of all the legal work that needs to go in, or the people who are coordinating. It costs money to do ballot initiatives on both sides. If you take away the ability for those funding opportunities, again, you're limiting it to individual people being able to bankroll ballot initiatives. So that's one thing. The other thing we're concerned about is legislation coming up this spring. Again, we could see any of those trends, raising numbers, changing how you collect. I'm really concerned about the funding again. So we anticipate that might be coming. Continued legal challenges. Again, we are already still seeing that with medical marijuana and others. And then finally, and this is a newer development, but increased federal scrutiny, particularly related to groups and funding. So we know that's going to go up. So how can we be prepared for that? How can we be ready? So it looks like a dumpster fire, right? It's very stressful to put all this together because you get to the end and you're like, ah! But you can do things. You can do things. So what can you do? Immediate action steps. Email your state senator and tell them of your concern or support for any of these things. Do it now. You don't have to wait till session. They are going to be less likely to move things forward or just let it pass through committee if they know before session there's no interest in these things. So let them know. Submit an online comment for that LR 206 that I talked about. They're due 8 a.m. the day of, so I would say set your deadline for Thursday, October 23rd. The testimony for that day is invited only. I am concerned about who is invited, and I hope that it is representative. We need folks to be submitting online so that, our senators only know what they hear. So if we have senators who are unfamiliar with the process and the hearing is structured in a certain way, we need to make sure they're hearing all of our voices. So it doesn't have to be a novel, doesn't have to be well researched. It can just be, hey, I worked on a ballot initiative and I collected signatures and I think that's a good thing. Whatever you want to do. You can also email that committee directly with your concerns or your support. If you're available, watching or live streaming the hearing on that Friday morning. The other piece I would say with this is if you hear something in that hearing that doesn't sound right, or you have a different perspective on, email the committee after and provide that context. Again, I think a lot of our work is making sure that we're sharing the reality on the ground, which I know many of us know because we did it. And then finally, we're going to have more ballot initiatives. We may have a ballot initiative about a ballot initiative, which is ballot initiative inception. So, go work on a ballot initiative, collect signatures, see what that's like. A really useful tool for that is also to become a notary, because that's something that's absolutely necessary. And particularly with the increase in scrutiny, we need people to be able to do that. Additional action steps, longer term, educate others. I will talk to anyone, anywhere, anytime about anything. So if you have a church group, a book club, a, group that sits out on the patio and has a beer every Friday night, I'm happy to come wherever and talk about what issue might be interesting. Just shoot me an email. Consider joining. If you aren't part of our organization, please do. That gets you looped into announcements, keeps you up to date without having to put in a ton of work. Same thing with things like Common Cause or Civic Nebraska and lots of other orgs that I'm not mentioning, but I know are on this call, them too. Sign up for action alerts. I do action alerts during session, predominantly during session. So if you really want to dig in a little bit more and get more up-to-date information, you can sign up for those. Oh my, it didn't like that. I don't know what I did. Here we go. Okay. Sorry, friends, technology. Find other ways that you can be involved with democracy, registering voters, volunteering at polling places. One thing that I hit at the beginning, and I just really want to reiterate this, we are in a time where people are asserting things with confidence that have no foundation. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know if that's right. Always lead with listening, because there could be, you want to understand exactly where their ideas or their interests or their concerns are coming from. But this is not the time to be shy about things. If something doesn't sound right, I think it's okay to say something. Similarly, anytime you can be in person with people with real conversations is incredibly important. It's much harder to say something cruel or dehumanize someone when you're looking at them in the eye as opposed to over a keyboard. And then finally, tentatively plan to attend the People's Day. This was an event we did last spring. I tentatively picked Monday, March 23rd, but sign up for my action alert so you can get the for sure day. And this is just a day for everyone to, like an open house at the Capitol. You can come in, you'll have someone who will help you do whatever you want to do. Talk to a certain senator, watch debate, talk to a lobbyist. We'll kind of walk you through that process to make it more accessible. So I know that was a ton and it was really fast and I'm very sorry, but there was a lot to cover. So we've got probably about 10 more minutes or a little shorter for questions. So Amanda, do you want to start with whatever's in the chat?
I'd love to. And first of all, before we even begin, thank you so much for such a whirlwind tour of what is happening in Nebraska, some of the external national pressures that are affecting what's happening in Nebraska, and especially what we can do about it. So, with that, let's start with the questions and we'll take them chronologically. Kathleen says, I recall voting on city and state referendums and initiatives. I don't recall any at the county level. And thinking back to that sort of like nesting graphic you had of city and then county, right? Kathleen says, is there a prohibition of initiatives at the county level? And if so, why?
That's a really good question. Um, and if somebody knows the for sure answer, let me know. I know what I do know is there is a bill about that right now from Senator Hardin, and I can't for the life of me remember if it's restricting it or opening it up. I think it's opening it up. So you don't see a lot of county ones, and I can't think of a single one right now, but it doesn't usually happen in the county, and they are looking at that as an area to potentially use as a tool. Lynn, did I
Great.
see you nodding your head or shaking your head?
I don't ever recall, and I've been
Okay.
here since 1980, that there's been a county initiative.
Yeah, that's a good question, Kathleen. And thank you, Lynn. And I'll look into that, and in a follow-up, I'll send a follow-up about that. It's a good question, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Next question from Jean McGuire. Do you know who has been invited to testify at the interim study on the ballot initiative process? Has the League of Women Voters been invited?
Yeah, great question. No, we have no idea who has been invited to that. And in my role, I work with a lot of coalitions, and in all of those relationships, none of us know who has been invited. So, Nebraska Table, ACLU, Common Cause, Rise, no one knows. We have not been asked, unless one of you have been asked. Please let me know if you have. So we have not been asked. This is even more important why I think we should have comments and also watch so we can correct things. There is some concern among advocacy groups that they would almost prefer not to talk because it's shooting fish in a barrel. It's just an opportunity to be put on the spot and asked questions that are difficult to answer and be used as a political tool. So, we'll see. If they want to hear from me, I'd be happy to. So if anybody knows someone on the committee, let them know. I'm happy to come.
Fantastic, will do. And just as a reminder,
Oh, you muted.
thank you. I was trying to do two things at once. But just as a reminder, in the chat, we have posted again the online portal where you can submit your comments about LR 206 that Rachel was just talking about. So, next question. Were there any differences, and this is from Jean Miller, so thank you. Were there any differences in process from older initiatives, say restoring the death penalty, to later initiatives, for example, medical marijuana? Thought that information would be helpful in submitting an online comment.
That is a good question, Jean. Broadly, no. In process, as far as I understand, and again, someone correct me if I'm wrong. I've only lived in Nebraska for 10 years. um, Broadly, no. However, there has been an increase in the legal challenges and things like that, and the executive branch taking more of an interest and um, stance in those types of things. So I don't think so, but I will check. I'll put that on my list. I'll call Heidi at Civic because she knows all the things.
Hey, perfect. And we just had Heidi, who last month, I believe, is a lunch and learn speaker.
Yeah.
And we can confirm she does know all the things. She's fantastic. It's been a great
Yes.
1-2 punch from the both of you. And a quick question from Lynn. Do I need to sign up for action alerts each legislative session, or does my sign up from the last session carry over?
Great question. So I'm figuring out the best method for this. And right now it carries over. I will be sending an email sometime in January just to say, please say that you still want this. So please respond to that. For two reasons. One, I don't want to keep sending to someone it's not useful. And two, our action alerts are so popular that I'm getting close to the limit of numbers I can send out to people. So if you are not getting them or you don't want them, please let me know. So I will send that out. Keep an eye out, and you can always re-sign up if for some reason you get removed. So just let me know. Question.
Great, thank you. From Katie, we have, Related to representation, but on a slightly different topic, do you have any idea about the context of the hearing tomorrow at 1:30 in room 1507 on public notice requirements? It's from the military, it's from the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs group sponsored by Sanders, and it's an interim study to investigate public notice requirements in Nebraska, including those mandated under the Open Meetings Act and the Administrative Procedure Act.
Great, great question. And if anyone does have knowledge, please feel free to jump in. I know that a Common Cause has been following that one, so I know that they're on top of it. I'm gonna pull it up real quick. If I remember correctly, it is looking to exempt a certain group. So, for example, like Foster Care Review Board is technically under the Opens Meeting Act, and there have been legislation proposed before that would say that's really sensitive. Maybe that one should not fall under that. If I'm thinking correct, I think that was the base. Something similar was the base of this one. But let me pull up that LR really quick to see. And again, if anyone else on the call knows exactly what that's about, please feel free to jump in. That is
Well,
invite only also.
Well, I was going to say, while you're pulling that up, if I could ask Paula to give us a quick preview of the November Lunch and Learn.
Hello, everyone. This is Paula Urick. I'm one of the other co-chairs for the Lunch and Learn Committee. Our next speakers in November 6th will be Heather Nelson, and she'll be speaking about Poll the Vote. And on December 4th, it will be Kim Morrow, who is with the Lincoln Mayor's Office, and she'll be talking about an update on the sustainability plan or climate change. Now, if you're interested in any of our past Lunch and Learns, they are available on the website at lincolnleague.org. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Lincoln-Lancaster County League, you can also join up at that site. So we really appreciate you joining today. And are there any more questions in the chat, Amanda? Does not look like it. Anybody want to speak up with any questions?
And while you do that, I dropped the LR for tomorrow. That is the one from Sanders. Something about it is again a specific, but it's related to lobbyists. So I'm not really sure. That's one we'll be watching.
This is Lori Benson. I do have a question. Rachel, could you please send out just a very brief little summary of the action items to take right now?
Yep.
That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. A great presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. And actually, Amanda, if it's all right with you, I'll send that to you to send out. And in that, I will also make sure to link where if you like getting those types of things from me, I'll have the link there where you can sign up for the future ones too.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon with Rachel Gibson talking to us all about representation in Nebraska, why it matters, and what we can do about it, most importantly. So please join us next month, November, first Thursday at noon for our next Lunch and Learn. And we thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with you to keep Nebraska a democracy that works for us all. Rachel, thanks again. Have a good day, everyone.